Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome to a review of the 11th, yes, 11th, we're still doing this, John Gardner James Bond continuation novel 1991's The Man from Barbarossa. The book that Gardner cited several times as being his own personal favourite of his own James Bond novels, and if this was his favourite, then my god, he must have really hated everything else that he ever wrote. Okay, that's possibly an unfair thing to say, but I will get into why I think Gardner would cite this as being his favourite of his own work later, but it is certainly, I think, his biggest creative departure from what is, I guess, the Bond novel house style. And 11 books in, you know, I can't blame the guy for wanting to experiment a bit. I mean, Fleming did it, obviously, with his own works. His ninth novel was The Spy Who Loved Me, where James Bond wasn't even the main character. So I can respect and admire the desire to break out of the box and try something a little bit different, but The Spy Who Loved Me is one of my least favourite of the Ian Fleming stories, and The Man from Barbarossa is, spoiler alert, one of my least favourite of Gardner's continuation novels so far. But then on the flip side of that, I have to say that quite honestly, the first 3 or 4 chapters of this book were some of my favourite and some of the most gripping that I've read in all of Gardner's stories so far, so ranking this one is going to be quite interesting. Okay, so starting with the chapters that I loved, the story opens with a prelude that talks about Operation Barbarossa, which I have to admit I'd never heard of before, so for the similarly uninitiated as I was, Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. The operation started in June 1941. As part of this invasion, the Nazis massacred several thousand Jewish people at a place in Ukraine called Babi Yar. The prelude is quite short and blunt with describing this, and I thought it hugely effective and quite profound in all honesty. I'm not sure if that's a testament to Gardner's writing, or if it is just the unending horrific nature of these events that remain as powerful as they do, even all these years on, but I do want to say that it can often be a very tricky, thorny thing, invoking real-life tragedies like that for pulpy entertainment, and it can come down to a question of taste, and I don't think it's really my place to say whether Gardner is treating these things tastefully in this story, but I must say that when he was recalling events from time to time, he will do it more later on in the story, I couldn't help but find it utterly sad and impacting, and I think that, you know, if he's going to be using such details as a basis for a James Bond story, I think he handles it as sensitively as possible. So while recounting aspects of Operation Barbarossa, Gardner introduces us to Joseph Vorontsov, who is a fictional character created by Gardner. He's a Nazi who was involved in the massacre. The first chapter of the book then moves 50 years into the future, and suddenly we're in New Jersey reading about the life of some elderly American citizen named Joel Penderick. He is kidnapped by a Russian terrorist group known as the Scales of Justice, who believe that he is actually Joseph Vorontsov, having escaped to America after World War II finished and assumed an alternative identity. We move to London, and M obviously calls in James Bond to collaborate with the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. M has received information that the kidnapped man is in fact not Joseph Vorontsov, as the real Vorontsov is under surveillance of Mossad already, so they think that the Scales of Justice have the wrong man. So this is probably the best story hook, personally, that I've experienced in all of Gardner's work so far. I really loved the mystery of it, the question mark of, like, is this guy really a Nazi, or is he an innocent man just caught up in this whole thing out of error? It reminded me a lot of the case of the guy that they thought was Ivan the Terrible. He was the subject of a documentary on Netflix called The Devil Next Door. He was a man who was living in Cleveland in the US, and he was accused of being a Nazi prison camp guard, and he was put on trial in Israel. This all took place in the late 1980s, and I assume it was the basis, certainly some inspiration for John Gardner with this story, but, you know, I thought it was interesting. I'd previously speculated in my last video, talking about Gardner's work, that with the Soviet Union collapsing around this time and the Cold War coming to an end, I thought that Gardner might well move stories away from that area while things remain uncertain. I'm certainly proven wrong with this book. book. I mean, he really leans into current events and politics of the time in this one in a big way. So Bond is paired up with Pete Natkowitz from Mossad, and they also meet up with French intelligence agents, and they head to Moscow, where the Scales of Justice have started assassinating members of the Soviet government, and they're going to put on a mock trial for Vorontsov and film it. And so Bond goes undercover as a cameraman, and then there's this Soviet agent named Nina Bibikova who is brought in too to pose as Bond's wife. And hey, this is more great setup, like Bond having to work with so many international agents, including the KGB. I think that this is all brilliant setup. Sadly, for me at least, it plays out in the most excruciatingly boring way imaginable. I really have to hold my hands up, in all honesty, on this one and just say that about, a good third of the middle of this story kind of went straight over my head. There are so many characters and names to keep track of in this, and obviously it's John Gardner, so characters have aliases, and then there are twists where they switch allegiances, or they're supposed to be somebody dead, but they're not really dead, and I just got completely lost. I was genuinely about halfway through the book when I suddenly just had a moment of realization where I was like, I have no clue what the main thrust of this story is supposed to be anymore. It ends up escalating into a plot where the leader of the Scales of Justice wants to exploit the then current war between the US and Iraq by supplying the latter with nuclear weapons, and I can't tell you how the kidnapping of the old guy from the beginning factors into this, or whether he really was Vorontsov or Penderik, because I just completely got lost in the sea of names and characters. And like I say, this being John Gardner, I kind of suspected or knew that half of them were going to be double or triple crosses anyway, so at this point it's a really frustrating trope of his writing that I really over it. It really does get to a point where I just become so disinterested in anyone, because there are so many misdirects and double dealings. It just becomes tedious and frustrating, and especially in one like this when there is so little action going on. It is a very talky book, and Bond is weirdly not present for an awful lot of it, and every now and then there'll be some kind of detail or recollection based on real world events of Nazis massacring Jewish people during World War II, and I'm suddenly snapped back into it again, because like I say, those stories are so terribly sad and profound to read about. It's, like I say, I think that says more to the real world horror of those events than Gardner's writing, but whatever. In a lot of ways, this didn't even feel like much of a James Bond story to me. Yes, it escalates, and yeah, there's obviously, world domination plot and all that kind of stuff, but the character feels somewhat shoehorned into this scenario, and I was reminded in a few places of just how far the character has actually been removed from Ian Fleming's original creation. I'm gonna read a line from chapter 11. This is just after a waiter has arrived. He's arrived with a selection of breakfast items for Bond. You have bacon, eggs, hash browns, tomatoes, juice, rolls, toast, confiture, coffee. This okay for you? Then, as an afterthought, on the house, is all on the house. Bond blanched slightly. Breakfast was the best meal of the day, though he did not normally eat eggs and bacon. Fine, he lied. Splendid. I'm very often reading these on my commutes, and when I read that little bit, I did have to, people around me must have thought that I was reading something very profound, and I just needed to take a moment to sort of take in the gravity of it or something, because I was honestly so taken aback by the detail that Bond did not like eggs and bacon for breakfast. And then I was like, is this a clue? And this is going to be some really avant-garde twist where it turns out that the character who we think is James Bond throughout so much of the novel is going to be a twist at the end, and turns out it wasn't really James Bond, because the story is such a departure anyway. I was genuinely wondering if things were going to be that wild, or maybe John Gardner was just gaslighting the reader. Because saying that the literary version of James Bond does not normally eat eggs is like saying that bears prefer to use inside lavatories. If he does not eat eggs in some form in all of the Fleming novels, eggs are at least mentioned, surely, in every single one of those books. I mean, there is an entire passage in one of the short stories where James Bond gives his perfect recipe for scrambled eggs. I genuinely don't know if Gardner just forgot such a detail, or maybe he just hadn't been back to, reread the Fleming novels. I mean, when you look at John Gardner's output, he is releasing, if not 1-2 novels a year at this point, which is kind of insane when you think about it. So yeah, I guess he is gonna forget details, but it is just one of those things where it's so prominent throughout all of the Fleming books that you know, I'd find it hard to forget, personally. Like, yeah, Bond likes his eggs. He eats them fairly regularly. It was just a detail that really stood out to me as kind of like, oh, we really are not in Kansas anymore, are we? One of the more notable things to happen in the story is during the climax. For a chapter or so, we are led to believe that James Bond is dead, and I think that this is a very interesting concept to play with that is completely wasted in this story. So it happens later on in the book, and Bond is getting dressed, and for some reason Gardner makes special mention of Bond's favourite denim jacket reinforced with leather patches. This favourite denim jacket, which, bearing in mind, I don't think has ever been mentioned before, but okay, I'm kind of like, well, this is an odd aspect of Bond's clothing that is being underlined here, but then I was like, well, okay, well, maybe Gardner was really into his denim around this time. It was the early 90s, I don't know. Anyway, it turns out that the whole reason behind him wearing this jacket is because there is a shootout, and they find a dead body wearing Bond's clothes, including the jacket. They get some characters in to identify the body, and they're like, oh no, it's him, he's dead, it's 1,000,000% James Bond, I'd recognize his beloved denim jacket with the leather patches any day. So I'm like, okay, fine, there's more books coming after this. I obviously know that James Bond is not dead, but the thing is that the characters end up seeming so stupid for believing this, because the body that they come across wearing Bond's clothes has had its face shot off. So there isn't really even an element of intrigue as to like, oh wow, I wonder how James has pulled this one off, because it's like, well, it's so obvious, he just switched his clothes with a dead guy. But the fact that all the other characters are just so willing to believe that, yeah, this is the case is kind of baffling. Like, he even goes to M receiving the news, and he's like, oh dear, someone will have to tell Moneypenny. It's like, what? It's just a really clumsy detail handled in a really kind of clunky way, and I just don't believe that any of these characters would be so quick to believe that, oh yeah, the faceless corpse wearing a jacket, oh yeah, that's obviously gonna be James Bond. And obviously, eventually, we get to like, okay, well, how did James Bond do this? And in my head, I'm just kind of thinking, oh, well, he found a body with, and, you know, had the idea when he saw the guy with his face shot off. But no, it turns out he orchestrates the whole thing right down to killing a soldier and then shooting the man's face off. Like, it's really not that good a plan, James, but, you know, obviously it works out for him in the end, but, you know, it takes some mind to think of, like, I'm gonna shoot this man's face off. I was really fluctuating between just dislike, boredom, and sheer incredulity by the time I was getting to the end of this. And you know what? I couldn't even tell you who the main villain was by the end. I finished this book a week prior to filming this video, and I had to go online and be like, okay, General Yuskevich is the main villain, and I can't tell you if that's his real name or an alias, or if he's actually a Bond girl disguised as a general. I have no idea, because all of the characters and double crosses that go on in this, I'm sorry, I just lost track of everything, and particularly when there are some of these Russian names that I'm really not familiar with, and there are so many of them, and aliases and whatever, and I'm just like, I cannot keep track of people. I actually kind of like the very ending of the book, I must say. Bond receives the Order of Lenin, and he leaves it behind in M's office, which I thought was quite a nice detail that he doesn't take it with him. And again, I think that the concept of Bond, particularly in the early 90s, teaming up with the KGB is a very good concept. Love the initial hook, and I enjoyed the mystery of it, but this is a story that just felt like it really exemplified all of Gardner's biggest flaws as a Bond continuation writer. As I said at the start of this video, Gardner cited this book as being the favourite of his own Bond continuation novels, and I think that a big part of the reasoning for that is because it is such a departure from the Bond novel house style. It's obviously going to speak to anyone's ego that, like, oh right, yes, I prefer the one where I feel like I really put my own stamp on it, rather than all of the ones where I was trying to emulate the, you know, the writings of a long dead guy at this point. I found The Man from Barbarossa to be bloated and boring, and really held a magnifying glass over some of the more irritating foibles of Gardner's Bond stories. There are way too many characters, and the plot is just way too bloated for what it really comes down to. That being said, I do think that some of those opening chapters were some of the best of Gardner's work that I've read so far, and I think it was a really bold move to make a Bond story that felt super contemporary to the time in which it was written, so believe it or not, that is going to keep this book off of the very bottom spot of my Gardner ranking. I'm going to be placing it second from the bottom instead, but it's certainly the Gardner story that I'm most disappointed with, actually. Like I say, based on those first few chapters and the fact that Gardner said that this was his favourite, and I did come into this knowing that, I had really high hopes, but ultimately I just couldn't wait to finish and move on to the next. Speaking of next, we only have 5 more Gardner novels to go, and if you've been watching all of these videos, thank you so much. Thank you for sticking with me. I'm a Bond completist, so I'm gonna read every novel, no matter what, but I'm also trying my very best to just do them completely in chronological order, because I really want to experience them that way, and it can be tough in times like this, when, like, the Charlie Higson book came out recently on His Majesty's Secret Service, and everyone's reading it and talking about it, and I'm like, sorry, I'm stuck in 1991, but, you know, give it a few years and I'll be caught up. Of course, please do let me know your thoughts on The Man from Barbarossa in the comments section below. Does anyone else, like, agree with John Gardner? Like, is this the favourite of anyone's of his work? If you do want to stay up to date on future video uploads, of course, please do consider scrolling below and clicking the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button. There's also links to my various social media pages below. Yeah, why not give this video a like? With all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.